Okay, Stefania, we are live on YouTube, so take it away.
Okay, so welcome to today's edition of VMACS. Nicola Fuchs-Schunden will be presenting her joint paper on the long-term distributional and welfare effects of COVID-19 school closings, a very important topic right now, and with Dirk Kruger, Alexander Ludwig, and Irina Popova. And the talk will be 45 minutes, and then there will be 15 minutes for open Q&A. If you have any clarifying questions, just use the chat feature to ask those questions during the talk. And if you have any substantial questions, please save them till the end so we can have an open discussion on those. Having said that, Nicola, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot, Stefania, for having me. It's a pleasure to present here. So I guess the motivation for our paper is fairly straightforward. As a reaction to the COVID-19 outbreak in the spring of 2020, most governments worldwide closed schools and childcare centers. And while there was initially a lot of discussion about the closures of businesses, there was not so much discussion in the political world and also in the media on the closure of schools. And one reason for that is probably that the cost of closing businesses, they are very salient because they arise immediately, while the cost of closing schools cannot be observed right away, at least when it comes to the cost for the children, they only arise in the long run. And here is where we want to step in with our paper. We want to give an estimate of the long run effects on the children from the school closures in terms of their earnings and their welfare. And we also analyze heterogeneous effects. So how large are the effects for children that come from different parental backgrounds. So ultimately, what we want to understand is, does the transitory shock of school closures lead to persistent effects? So to answer this question, we built a 2 generations partial equilibrium household model that we calibrate to the US economy. So it's a partial equilibrium model, and there are only 2 generations in the model, the current parents and the current children, and then we follow them until the end of their life cycle. And at the core of the model, there's a human capital accumulation that happens during the childhood of the children. And there are 2 crucial inputs that the children receive into their human capital accumulation. The first is governmental investment that comes through public schooling. And the second is parental investment that comes in the form of both monetary investment and time investment. When the children turn adults, they take higher education decisions. So they decide whether to complete high school and whether to attend and complete college. So in this setup, now the COVID-19 shocks arises, and we model it in the form of 2 experiments. The first one, and the main one we are interested in, is an exogenous reduction of the government schooling input. And then in an extended experiment, we add to that the recession that leads to a parental income drop. But in the interest of time, most of the results that I will present today only refer to the first experiment, to the school closures alone. And of course, we allow for an endogenous reaction of both the parents and the children to the school closures. So these are our main findings. We find that 6 months of school closures are associated with a lifetime earning loss of -1% for the affected children on average. And associated with this is a welfare loss of -0.63% as measured in the consumption equivalent variation. There is heterogeneity in this loss in terms of the age of the children when the school closures happen, and the largest losses arise for children of age 6. So for them, the welfare drop is -0.75%. When we add the recession additionally to the 6-month school closures, obviously the welfare effects become larger, but not by much. So now the total welfare loss is -0.7%. So what that means is from the perspective of the children, the school closures themselves are much more important than the parental income drop that comes through the COVID recession. So 90% of the overall welfare loss comes from the school closures alone. Then in terms of heterogeneity, we find that the losses are decreasing in both parental education and parental wealth. And last, we document significant parental reactions to the school closures. And without these parental reactions, the welfare losses for the children would be substantially larger. So in terms of related literature, I won't go over this in detail, but obviously our paper is related to the literature that talks about the human capital production function and the importance of early childhood education, as well as the importance of public education for inequality intergenerational mobility and welfare. And last, there exists an empirical literature that looks at the effects of schooling time on outcomes for children, exploiting different exogenous variations in schooling time, like the amount of snow days or teacher strikes or episodes like that. Most of these papers look at relatively short-term outcomes like test scores, but there are a few that also look at a longer-term outcomes, so longer-term earnings effects, and I will compare our results to this literature at the end of this talk. So then in terms of the outline, I will go straight to the quantitative model, show you the most important setup, go to the functional forms and calibration, and then discuss the results. Okay, so there are only two generations in the model, the current parents and the current children. So let me start out discussing the life cycle of these two generations, and I start out with the life cycle of the parental household. So we model the parental household starting at age J equal to JF, which is the fertility age. So we model the parents from the time when they have children. And at that point in time, we take the initial distribution of parents with respect to their marital status, their education, and their assets directly from the data. And then while the parents are between age JF and JA plus JA, where JA is the age when the kids turn adults, during that time, the parents have the children in the household, and then they choose how much to invest into their children in terms of both monetary investments and time investment. And apart from that, they have a standard consumption savings problem. They work and they pay taxes. Then when the parents are of age JF plus JA, the children turn adult and leave the household. And only at that age do we allow the parents to pay inter vivos transfers B to their children. And then from then onwards, the parents are not that interesting anymore. They continue working, and at some point they retire. So they earn an income, they get retirement income, they have a consumption savings problem and pay taxes. So what are the earnings of the parents while they are working? They work for the wage W, eta epsilon, where eta is an idiosyncratic shock that we model as a two-state Markov process, and epsilon is an age and education-specific wage profile. Working time depends on the marital status, but is exogenous in the model. So there's no endogenous labor supply response in the model. So that is it for the parents. The children are a bit more interesting and more important. And here's the life cycle of a child household. So the children are modeled from birth onwards. So at age J0, they are born. And they draw their initial human capital, which depends on both the marital status of the parent and the education of the parent. And then while the kids are young, so until age JA, they stay with their parents and they receive the inputs into their human capital, namely the monetary investment by the parents, the time investment by the parents, and the governmental investments through public schooling. Then the kids turn adult at age JA, and at that point in time, they have accumulated certain human capital age JA. And now they receive potentially inter vivo transfers from the parents, which become their initial assets, and they make their higher education decisions. So they decide whether to drop out of school and start working right away, whether to complete high school, or whether to go on and complete college. So when the children decide to stop education, then they start working right away. If they decide to finish high school, they have to pay a psychological cost of attending high school that depends on their human capital. They also work, but less than full-time, and that again is all taken exogenous. And other than that, they have a standard consumption savings problem. If they go further on to attend college, again, college attendance is associated with a psychological cost that now depends not only on their own human capital, but also on the education of the parents. And college comes with a tuition cost that they have to pay. And then after HJC, all kids enter the labor market. From then on, they work, and at some point they retire. So the earnings of the children are very similar to the earnings of the parents. They work for the wage W, gamma, epsilon, eta, epsilon. So again, the eta is an idiosyncratic shock. The epsilon is the age and education specific wage profile. What is new here is the gamma, which is an individual fixed effect that maps the human capital at the point when they turn adult into a fixed productivity effect. And I will describe how we model that in the calibration section. So this is the main setup, and the most important component of the model is the human capital production function. So during the childhood, human capital next period is a function of human capital this period, of the age, and of the three investments, namely parental monetary investment, parental time investment, and government investment. And the properties of this human capital production function is that we model it as a multiply nested function with imperfect substitutability. And it has the two properties that we typically assign to human capital production functions, namely first self-productivity. So that means higher human capital today leads to higher human capital tomorrow. And secondly, dynamic complementarity between human capital and investment. So the same investment pays out more, the higher is the human capital. Then regarding the higher education decision of the children, I think I mentioned most of this already. The children leave the parental household at age JA. At that point, they have acquired some human capital and they receive inter vivos transfers. And now they take this higher educational decision by just comparing the value functions for dropping out of high school, completing high school, or completing college. If they choose to attend high school, they have to pay a utility cost that depends on the human capital. If they choose to further attend college, there's a further utility cost that additionally depends on parental education, and there are the tuition costs. So then let me directly get to the functional form and the calibration. So we have a 2-year frequency in the model. So schooling or human capital production happens from age 4 to age 14. So in fact, we don't start the kids out at birth, but at age 4, because age 4 is the first age at which we can observe test scores, which we use as a proxy for initial human capital in the data. So anything that happens before age 4 is taken as exogenous, and it's obviously a combination of nature and nurture. So then from age 4 to age 14, kids are in school and receive the 3 investments into their human capital. At age 16, they turn adult and they take their higher education decision. If they choose to go on in high school, they graduate from high school at age 18. And if they further choose to complete college, they graduate from college at age 22. So the initial distribution of the parents at the fertility age is directly taken from the PSID. And parents in the model vary by marital status. They can be single or married. They vary by their own education. So the parents can be high school dropouts, high school graduates, or college graduates. And we allow for 5 different initial asset quintiles for the parents. And the number of children per parental household also depends on the marital status and the education of the parents, and is taken directly from the PSID. The initial human capital of the children, I already mentioned that, also depends on parental education and parental marital status, and is taken according to the PSID Child Development Supplement test scores at age 4. So at age 4, there are test scores for these children in the data set, and we take directly the initial human capital by these parental characteristics from the data. And that's how these test scores look like for the different parental households. So first, conditional on marital status, the initial test scores of the children, which are our proxy for the initial human capital, are increasing in the education of the parents. So that's the case for both single parents and for married parents. And then conditional on education, children of married parents tend to have higher test scores than children of single parents, with the exception of college-educated parents. So we take these test scores, translate them directly into initial human capital of the children in our model. Then the preferences, we take standard preferences as separable in the utility from consumption and the disutility of hours worked. So LM are the hours worked, which depend on the marital status. And for married couples, they are roughly twice the size for singles in the data. And then we divide here by 2. And then while the children are in the household, the parents can decide how much to invest, how much time to invest into their children. So IT is the investment per child, so we multiply that with the number of children. And this K here just allows for the fact that the disutility from spending or investing time in the children might be different than the disutility from hours at work. And phi here corresponds to the Frisch elasticity. So we don't have endogenous labor supply, but it matters obviously for the welfare calculations. Then the budget constraint is standard, and we allow for 4 different kind of taxes: nonlinear labor income taxes, capital income taxes, payroll taxes, and consumption taxes. And then the parents and the children are both subject to borrowing constraints that look slightly different for the 2 generations. So for the parents, we set the borrowing constraint at the lowest asset quintile at the fertility age, and then assume it's linearly decreasing in absolute value towards 0 until retirement. And for the children, we allow no borrowing for those that drop out of high school or only complete high school. If the children attend college, we allow them to borrow up to 85% of the college tuition. And then also their budget borrowing constraint is linearly decreasing towards 0 until retirement. So the most important component of the model is the human capital production function. And this is a 3-layered function. And here I show you the outer nest of this function. So the human capital next period is an aggregate of human capital this period and the investment into human capital. And sigma h measures the substitutability between human capital and investment. And kappa jh is the age-dependent weight on human capital in this nest here. And then in the middle nest, we aggregate the governmental investments and the parental investment into total investments into human capital. And sigma g is the elasticity of substitution between governmental investments and parental investments. And kappa gj is the weight on the governmental investments. And again, we allow this weight to be age dependent. And then last, in the innermost nest, we define the parental input as an aggregate of the monetary input of the parents and the time input of the parents. And sigma m is the elasticity of substitution between money and time. And this kappa mj is the weight on the monetary investment. So obviously, for crucial importance of the model are these 3 elasticities, as well as these 3 weights that are age dependent. So how do we calibrate them? So first we take the elasticities directly from the literature. So we set sigma h equal to 1. So this is the middle estimate for younger and older children from Konya, Heckman, and Schenach. We set sigma g equal to 2.43. That comes from the paper by Kotera and Seshadri. And we set sigma m equal to 1, as in Lee and Seshadri. And for these age-dependent weights, we actually calibrate them, and we use as a target the age-dependent time and monetary inputs by the parents. So here I show you how the calibrated values for the kappas look like. So here on the left, this is the kappa h, that is from the outer nest, the weight on human capital versus investment. And this is depicted here against the age of the child from 4 to 14. And as you see, the weight on human capital is increasing in the age of the child. So that is kind of intuitive. The older the kid is, the more important is human capital versus the current investment into their human capital. Here on the right, you see the weight in the inner nest, so which nested money and time. And this is a weight on monetary investments. And here you also see that the weight on monetary investment is increasing in the age of the child. So for younger children, time investments by the parents are relatively more important. And for older children, monetary investments are relatively more important. And then for the middle nest, that nests the governmental input and the parental input, we set the kappa gj equal to 0.676 for all school-age children. So that comes again from the literature from Kotera and Seshadri, who estimate this value for children of school age. And then we allow for potentially different value for children of age 4 because they are not in formal schools yet. And we calibrate this value to be equal to 0.58. So for the children who are not yet in school, the weight on governmental investments is a little bit lower than for the school-age children. So when the kids turn 16, they leave the parental household. If they drop out of school, they enter right away into the labor market. But if they decide to finish high school, they accumulate further human capital. But now, since they left the parental household, that we don't model the parental investments into the children anymore. Okay. So at age 16, human capital next period is just a function of human capital today and the governmental investment. And then we use this factor A tilde here to kind of substitute for this missing parental inputs, and we calibrate it to match the ratio of test scores at age 16 relative to age 14, which is 1.05 on average. Okay. So what this also means is that our model is not a very good model to predict what happens to children who are of age 16 when the schools close. Because for these children now, there is no margin of response anymore. They cannot, they don't invest into their own human capital, and the parents stopped investing into their human capital. Right? So our model is not a very good predictor for these children, but obviously this human capital process at age 16 is still important to know also for the parents of younger children who understand that this is how it looks like, that up from age 16 onwards, the kids are basically on their own. Okay, and then when the children enter the labor market, their human capital gets mapped into a fixed productivity. So how do we do that? We follow here Abbott et al. And assume the following functional form. So here you see the fixed effect, and this is a function of the human capital. And the gradient depends on the chosen education level of the children. And like Abbott et al., we estimate this on data from the NLSY 79, where we proxy the fixed effect with the wage residual and the human capital with the armed forces qualification test scores. And if you then estimate this equation, what you find is that the ability gradient is increasing in education. So the human capital is more important in the individual fixed effects for children who complete college than for those who only complete high school or even drop out of high school. So there's a complementarity between education and human capital here. So let me quickly discuss the model fit here. First, I show you targeted moments, namely the parental investment profiles by the age of the child. So on the left are monetary investments, and on the right are time investment. And on the x-axis, you see the biological age of the child. And black is the data, blue is the model. So as you see here, monetary investment is kind of flat by age of child. The data is a bit noisy here, but it's approximately flat, and we target it, and obviously the model gets that right. By contrast, time investment in data and model are strongly decreasing by the age of the child. So there's a lot of time investment into young children and much less into older children. And here now I show you a few non-targeted moments, namely again, monetary investment and time investment, but this time accumulated over the entire childhood of the children, but by the parental education. Okay, so here on the x-axis is parental education. Here are parents who are high school dropouts, high school graduates or college graduates. And as you see in the data, monetary investments are strongly increasing in the education of the parents, while time investment are only very slightly increasing in the education of the parents. And our model actually replicates this fairly well. So this is a non-targeted moment, but the model gets it qualitatively right. Okay, then in this setup comes our experiment, and the first and main experiment is the lockdown of schools. So in the baseline, we assume that schools are closed for 6 months, which in our 2-year frequency translates into a drop of governmental inputs by 25%. So this is our baseline experiment. And then in the extended experiment, we add to that the asymmetric income shock that comes from the recession. So how do we do that? Well, we looked at the GDP drops in 2020 in the first and second quarter, and we assume full recovery in the third quarter. So in that sense, we are too optimistic because we already know that didn't happen. So in our 2-year frequency, this translates in an income loss for the parents of roughly 5%. So based on the data by Big and Blandin, we assign 92% of this income drop to a loss in hours, and only 8% to a loss in productivity. And that turns out to be important because if the income drop is associated with a loss in hours, that means that parents potentially have more time now to invest into their children. And last, according with data by the BLS, that shows that unemployment rates increased by almost twice as much for lower education groups and for college educated. We also take that into account. So the income shock is asymmetric and it's more than twice as large for parents who are either high school dropouts or high school graduates than for college educated parents. Okay, then I'll get to the results. So these are the main results. And let's first look at the upper panel. So the upper panel shows you the share of children who drop out of high school, who complete high school, or who complete college. These are the baseline estimates. And then these are the effects of the experiment, namely the average percentage point change, and then the percentage point change for children who are 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, or 14 years old when the school closures happen. So let's first look at the average effect. So we find that on average, the share of college educated children decreases by minus 0.61%, and the share of high school dropouts increases by 0.55%. So that doesn't sound like huge numbers, but if you translate it into percent increases, it means that we observe a 4.5% increase in the number of high school dropouts and a 1.8% decrease in the number of college graduates. Okay, so these are substantial changes in the final educational attainment of the affected children. Where do these changes come from? Well, they come from this loss in human capital. So we find that on average, the children have 1.54% lower human capital at the point when they take the final educational decision than they would have had if the schools would have remained open. Okay. And as a consequence of this decrease in human capital and the lower educational attainment, the long-term earnings of these children decrease by minus 0.95%, so almost minus 1%. And the associated welfare loss in terms of the consumption equivalent variation is minus 0.63%. So if you look at the age pattern, I show it here in the welfare loss, you'll see that the largest effects are for children of age 6. And then the effects are smaller for older children, but they are still substantial even for the children who are 14 years old when the school closures happen. Even for them, we find a welfare loss of minus 0.5%. And the children of age 4, they have a somewhat lower welfare loss than the children of age 6, because in their human capital production function, the weight on the governmental inputs is smaller than for the school-age children. So in that sense, they are a little bit sheltered against these losses, and the welfare losses for them are a little bit smaller, but also for them, they are substantial with minus 0.62%. And why do we find this decreasing age pattern? Well, that comes from these two features of the human capital production function. First is self-productivity, which implies that any loss kind of accumulates in itself. The younger the children are when it happens. And secondly, it comes from the dynamic complementarity, and I will demonstrate that in a few slides. So these are the parental reactions that are associated with these losses that we find. So now we look at the parents, and these are the average baseline investments of the parents in terms of money, time, and inter vivos transfers. And these are the changes caused by the lockdown of schools. And on average, we find substantial reactions by the parents. So on average, the parents increase their monetary investment into the children by 5.2%, their time investment by 2.7%, and their inter vivos transfers by 0.5%. Okay. And these are the accumulated changes over the entire childhood of the children. So these reactions are substantial, and they really matter for the children. So we find that if we keep parental behavior constant, so if we don't allow for any adjustment in the behavior of the parents, the welfare losses of the children roughly double. Okay, so the welfare losses of the children from the school closures would be minus 1.25% rather than minus 0.63% if the parents would not counteract the school closures in the way that they do. And then obviously these parental reactions also come with a welfare loss to the parents. So we find that the overall welfare loss of the parents associated with the school closures is almost of the exactly same magnitude as for the children, namely minus 0.64%. However, most of this is really a consequence of altruism. So we have an altruism parameter. These parents care about their children. That's why they invest in them. So the welfare loss of the children translates also in the welfare loss of the parents. But if we shut down the altruism channel, we still find a welfare loss of the parents that is associated with this parental reaction of minus 0.12%. And now let's look at the age pattern of these parental responses. If you first look at average monetary and time investment, you see that this is increasing in the age of the children at the time of the lockdown. So where does this come from? Well, first, parents of younger children, they are more likely to be borrowing constrained because they are younger themselves. But secondly, it also comes from the dynamic complementarity. And I will demonstrate that in the next couple of slides. And then by contrast, the inter vivo transfers decrease in the age of the child. So for parents of younger children, they shelter their children from the welfare effect partly by increasing the inter vivo transfers more so than increasing their monetary and time investment than parents of older children. And here you see the effect of this dynamic complementarity. So in these two graphs, what I show you are the monetary and time investments for a given child that is of age 6 when the school closure happens. Okay. So this is not the biological age at the time of the school closure. So here we look at children who are of age 6 when the school closures happen, and we ask how much do the parents invest into them. And blue is the baseline, and red is the experiment. So what happens after the school closures. And first we observe large responses of the parents when the school closures happen. So here you see that at age 6, so when the school closures happen, the parents increase their monetary investment by more than 10% and also their time investment by roughly 10%. So there are large responses, immediate responses to counteract the effects of the school closures. But then if you follow these kids over time from age 8 to age 14, what you see is that parental investments are now a bit lower than they would have been in the absence of the school closures. So it's barely visible in the time investment. You see it a little bit more in the monetary investments. It's the red line is below the blue line. And where does that come from? Well, that comes from the fact that despite the strong reaction when the school closures happen, the kids suffer human capital loss. So the kids arrive at age 8 with lower human capital than they would have had in the baseline. And now as a response to this lower human capital, since this human capital production function features dynamic complementarity, the optimal investment of the parents in all future periods falls. Not by much, but it falls. And this is then the resulting human capital of the children who are of age 6 when the school closures happen. So here again, blue is the baseline, red is the experiment. And here you see a little bit that the two lines are opening up, but one cannot see it very well because just human capital is increasing so much over the childhood that the scale is very large. So on the right graph here, I translate this here and show you the difference between the red and the blue line. So this is this orange line here. So this is the human capital gap that arises for this child due to the school closures at age 6. So the immediate loss of human capital is around 1%. So despite the large parental responses, human capital of the child at age 8 is 1% lower than it would have been in the absence of the school closures. And then given the self-productivity in human capital and given the fact that now in all future periods, the parents invest slightly less into the child as they would have done otherwise, this human capital gap is now increasing for this child over its own childhood. So that by the age of 16, the human capital of the child is 1.8% lower than it would have been at in the absence of the school closures. Okay. So this is the underlying reason why we see larger welfare effect for children who are younger when the school closures happen. So now let's have a quick look at the long-term fiscal consequences. So I already told you the model predicts a long-term gross earnings decrease of minus 0.95% on average for the children. That translates into lower net decrease because of the progressivity of labor income taxation. So the net earnings decrease is minus 0.77%. But the flip side of this is that it translates into a higher loss of tax revenues for the government. So the predicted tax revenue loss in the long run for the government due to the lower incomes of the children is minus 1.61%. Now I show you the result where we add the income recession to the lockdown of schools. So when we model the COVID-19 experiment as both a lockdown of schools and an asymmetric income shock to the parents, the predicted welfare loss is minus 0.7%. So again, from the perspective of the child, the lockdown of schools is much worse in welfare terms than the income drop of the parents. So part of this is due to the time increase for parents. So the parents who become unemployed, they have more time available. And indeed, if we look at the parental reactions under this extended scenario, what we find is that they increase their time investment by more than if only the schools are closed. But on the other hand, they increase their monetary investment by less, and they actually reduce their inter vivos transfers. So even if we model the income shock as a pure productivity shock, so that it does not lead to any time increase for the parents, we still find that for the child, the welfare effects of the school closures are more important than the welfare effect of the recession that comes through the parental income loss. Now, in our baseline scenario, we assume that schools are closed for 6 months, but in many parts of the US, schools have remained closed after the summer. In New York, they are supposed to close again now. So how does it look like if schools are closed for longer? What we find is that the effects are disproportionately increasing over time. So if schools are closed for 1 year rather than 6 months, the welfare loss is more than double. They increase to minus 1.39%. And so the underlying reason for this convexity is, again, the self-productivity in human capital and the dynamic complementarity of human capital. So the larger the initial loss, the long-term effects rise disproportionately. Now let's get to the heterogeneity of the results. How do the welfare losses look like for children with different parental characteristics? I show you here the welfare losses again, only from the lockdown of schools for children that come from households with different parental education. So parents are high school dropouts or high school graduates or college graduates, and parental households from different asset quintiles. So from the lowest asset quintile to the highest one. And roughly speaking, in both dimensions, what we find is that the welfare losses are roughly 30% larger for children that come either from low educated households or from asset poor households than for the children that come from the highest educated household or the asset richest households. So there's a 30% decrease in the welfare loss if children come from households with poor socioeconomic background. And the reason is fairly straightforward. The asset poor households or the less educated households, they have fewer financial resources. They face the borrowing constraints, so they can increase their investment, especially the monetary investment into the children, less than the richer households. And now last, let me talk about online teaching. So we assume full school closures, but obviously, in reality, there's been a lot of digital teaching and so on. And I think a very open question still for research is how effective is this digital schooling? So I cite here a very recent paper by Engel and co-authors who looks at data from the Netherlands, where the Netherlands tests children both in February and in June. So they could right away see what is the effect of online teaching. And they find that digital teaching is just as bad as no teaching at all. So on average, it didn't help at all. But it is an open question of how should we think about digital schooling. Where we already have quite a bit of empirical evidence is that we have a large socioeconomic gradient in the participation in digital schooling. So I cite a paper here and I show you different graphs. This graph is from Opportunity Insights, and it looks at the percent change in student participation in an online math learning platform, which is called Zearn. And what you see is that when the lockdown happened and the school closed, participation for all children dropped. But then for children who come from high income regions, participation already in May, so before the summer holidays, was up to the level before the lockdown. But for children from middle income or low income households, it was still 30 or 40% below their participation before the lockdown. So I think there's ample evidence, and it's very intuitive that children that come from socioeconomically disadvantaged households participate less in online teaching. So we don't model online teaching explicitly, but we provide here a table where you can kind of pick your favorite estimate of how you think about that. And so the way we think about it is that one can translate the socioeconomic gradient in participation in digital schooling into different lengths of effective school closures. So for example, if you think that for children that come from households with college-educated parents, the effective school closures were only 3 months, while for children that come from households with high school dropout parents, the effective school closures are 6 months, well, then the welfare differences between these groups, they rise dramatically. Then the welfare effects for the children from the less educated households are already almost 3 times as large, rather than 30% larger than for children from the better educated households. Okay. So what is very clear is if they have the socioeconomic gradient in participation in digital schooling, then the heterogeneous effects become much, much larger than we have in the baseline. Okay. So last, before I conclude, let me quickly compare our results with some results that we already have. So we are writing this paper because obviously we cannot observe long-term earnings losses of the children yet, but what we can already observe is some parental responses. And especially there have been different surveys carried out that measure how much parents increase the time spent with the children during the school closures. And so our model predicts an increase of 1.3 hours per child and day spent by the parents after the school closures. And this is consistent with estimates, for example, by Adams-Prussell and her co-authors who conducted this survey in the US, but also with estimates from other countries like Australia or so on. And then in terms of the long-term earnings losses from this empirical literature that looks at schooling time and long-term earnings, we find that the paper that it closest to the episode that we are currently experiencing is a paper by Jaume and Willen for Argentina. So what Jaume and Willen do is they exploit heterogeneity in teacher strikes in Argentina, and they find that 6 months of lost teaching due to teacher strikes during elementary school leads to long-term earnings losses of the affected children of -2 to -3%. So we also have this 6 months of school closures, and in our model, the predicted long-term earnings losses for children of elementary school age, so for children age 6, is -1.15%. So this is lower than what Jaume and Willen find, but obviously it's a very different setting. It's a different country, but in that sense, our estimates might actually be conservative. So then let me conclude. So what we find is that 6 months school closures are associated with substantial long-run welfare losses. So the long-run earnings of the children on average drop by 1% and the welfare by -0.63%. And there is a socioeconomic gradient in the welfare losses that becomes steeper if we have socioeconomic gradient in the participation of digital schooling. Now, we freely admit that there are many elements in reality that are not in the model. So in terms of losses for children, what we don't model is the loss of social contact or the psychological stress for parents and children, and both might lead to lower non-cognitive skill accumulation of children. And we will know that non-cognitive skills also matter for long-term earnings. Another consequence we don't analyze are the long-run fiscal consequences of the current government spending programs, which probably will have to be borne by the currently young, so by the current children. But on the other side, we also don't look at any potential benefits from school closures. And most importantly, so this is not an infectious or an epidemiological model, and we don't talk about the potential health benefits from school closures at all. So that's also why we don't do have any optimal policy or don't say what is the right response to the pandemic. But we do hope that with this paper, we can provide an estimate of the potential costs that are associated with school closures so that policymakers can take that into account when making their decisions of whether to close schools or rather bars and restaurants. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Nicola, for ending exactly on time. That was perfect timing. So as usual, the floor is open to questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and feel free to, and we will unmute you and you can ask your question. So as the audience thinks about their question, I have a question that I wanted to start off with, which is, what is the role of private schooling in your model? Because of course you can think that it enters the resource investment from the parents, but actually in the US, where many kids are sent to private school, it's really just a substitute of the IG, the investment of the government. And does it matter that we are, we can only introduce it via the resource investment of the parents? Have you thought about that? Do you think that that's, the fact that it could be, I think is substitute, but the way it's entering here is sort of, it interacts in a complementary way, with all the other components of human capital. I just wanted to have your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So thanks a lot. You're completely right. I mean, in reality, kids go either to private school or to public school, while in our model, all kids go to public school and then parents can invest on top. So it's more like private tutoring or so than attending private school. So I think one reason why we didn't model private school is then it's also not so clear what the experiment is, because as we were discussing before we went online, private schools often had different rules in terms of school closures than public rules. Schools, they probably also have different means and possibilities to do digital teaching. So I think it would be an interesting question to incorporate that. And I think one thing that this would for sure lead to is that the socioeconomic gradient in the welfare losses again becomes larger. Because I think all the anecdotal evidence, at least that I heard, is that private schools tended to open up earlier or not close at all than public schools. And private schools are obviously more attended by children of richer households. So for sure, it would lead to a larger socioeconomic gradient if we would include that.
Yes, so I think the main, in the US, when the school closures were mandated at the beginning of the crisis, private schools also had to close. And I think it's more been in the fall that there's been this marked heterogeneity between private and public schools. Okay, so we have a question from Nicholas. Let me, Nicholas, you are muted. You can unmute yourself and then ask your question.
Hi, thanks, Stefania. Really nice presentation. I just had a question. It's somewhat related to Stefania's first question. First, it's a clarification. Was there heterogeneity in, I guess, the efficiency or the productivity of the schooling for different socioeconomic groups?
No, we don't model that. So the governmental input into the investment, the governmental input into children is the same for all children. We calibrate it to be roughly $5,000 per year.
Because it's similar in this way to Stefania's question. There's so much heterogeneity in the quality of schooling that children have access to here in the US. And perhaps one way to capture the idea that also higher income households use private schooling is to have a gradient in the efficiency of the schooling input into children's human capital that's correlated with the parents' income, for instance.
I think what's interesting here is that if we had this efficiency heterogeneity in schooling, so that schools that children from socioeconomic advantaged households visit are more efficient than schools in poorer regions, then it's not so clear what will happen to the welfare losses, because then the same, I mean, if the school closures would be the same, the basically effect on the children of richer households would be larger, because they miss more out from the schooling, which would be more efficient in the baseline. So that's actually an interesting component when it comes to this heterogeneity effect, is that in some sense, I think, while in the baseline we don't find that large of the socioeconomic gradient, is that for children that come from socioeconomically advantaged households, they also have, in a sense, more to lose, because they are the marginal children who will decide whether to attend college or not. And then also for them later on, the mapping of human capital and fixed productivity is steeper, because they on average obtain higher education. So this is a bit of a countervailing effect. Yeah.
So I mean, the real question on this one is, how is the quality of public schooling correlated with the propensity of school closures, right? I mean, you could make the argument that, you know, the poor kids, they go to schools in inner cities, and inner cities are much more heavily affected by COVID, whereas the rich kids, they go in the suburbs. Suburbs are less prone to the COVID crisis, and therefore less prone to school closures. Then you would get the effect, exactly the effect that you mentioned. If this is fairly uncorrelated, then I think Nicola is right. Then the fact that you know, the rich kids go to richer schools, which with school closures you have more to lose, would dominate.
Unfortunately, I haven't found any data yet. I mean, any good overview of how the school closures look like by these different characteristics, and by private and public schools on average. And I guess it's because it's so heterogeneous and there's so many school districts and so on. But it would be interesting once we have more evidence on that to include more of these heterogeneities in the model, for sure.
Okay, thank you. So Nazi has a question. Nazi, unmute yourself and then you can ask your question.
Yep. Thank you. Very nice presentation. So one thing that you can check is, you know, in schools that are in poor neighborhoods, or the, you know, kids that go to public schools from poorer backgrounds, they get more than education. No, they get school lunches, school breakfasts, and that can have I think there was lots of discussion on that, and there was lots of public debate that kids were losing more than that, and that could be like a productivity loss beyond not being exposed to teachers, so their might be dropped. So I think there has been some, this is easy to check potentially how many kids are using, you know, for school lunches, depending on their education, parental background.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point. I mean, as far as I know, I think some schools that closed actually kept up the lunch programs, exactly because they know that otherwise the kids
exactly
wouldn't get any lunch. So I think that this falls all in this these different things that are not in the model, and which also might be that school matters more for children of less advantaged families for these things, like just getting a lunch or maybe having a structured day, which is all important also for the long run development of the children, for sure. Yeah.
I mean, this is a little bit of a cop-out, but if you look at sort of our human capital production function, it's a fairly aggregated beast, right? So you could argue that part of what human capital accumulation is when it comes to public inputs is that, right? It doesn't have to be just you know, the narrow thing that you learn in school, but all the other inputs that the public puts into that human capital production that makes you being a better student, including just basic nutrition, right? I mean, so then it comes to exactly, you know, what are the parameters governing this human capital production? But interpreting this broadly, it is not only the teachers that get put in, but maybe the lunches, maybe the peer group effects, maybe what you learn on the bus, all that stuff is sort of captured in that human capital production function.
But then again, so in the baseline now we model the same reduction in this governmental inputs for all children, but that we would have to translate with some underlying data into heterogeneous reductions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Sort of related to that, I think Dirk was sort of addressing sort of this broad interpretation of the public investment in the human capital production function. I was struck by those results that you have on the participation in virtual schooling by essentially family background. I like the way that you model it in terms of, different length of effective school closures. But one thing that I was thinking about is that I think anecdotally, higher resourced parents, and by resourced, I mean either higher education or higher expenditures, have been more able, to help their kids in virtual schooling. That's why you see higher participation. And And so at some level, isn't that being captured to some degree by the contribution of the parents in human capital via their monetary and time expenditures? And I was wondering, are we sort of double counting it when we also, sort of exogenously extend the school closures? So what are you thinking? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess you are right. I mean, the reason why children of better educated parents also participate more in digital schooling is that they have the means. So they have a computer, they have internet, they have parents who tell them to go out of the bed and sit in front of the computer in the morning. And part of that is obviously, or this is captured in the monetary and the time input. But I think it's still different if you would say that some schools don't offer digital teaching at all and some do, or in that sense. And I guess I was actually asking some of the authors who look at this heterogeneity. Does it all come from the children's side, or how much of it comes from the school the school side, that poor schools don't even have, I mean, the teachers don't even have the laptop, so they don't start digital teaching. And so far I haven't found any evidence on that, but I think that would be the crucial question. Is it all from the parental side, or does it also, I mean, is it also heterogeneous in terms of what the schools in poor or rich districts actually offer? My suspicion is it will be a combination of the two. At least in Germany, it's a combination of the two, I think of it.
I think you're right. Anecdotally, just looking at media studies of this, it does seem that there's a lot of heterogeneity at the school level and at the level as well. And so that essentially what you're capturing is effectively that by extending the school closure.
Yeah.
Okay. So I would like to encourage the audience to ask questions if you have any. In the meantime, what are the implications for mobility in your analysis? Because economic mobility, across generations, it's not something that you look at specifically, but your model would have implications for that, right? So I know it's a sort of a big question, but I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So we actually, in the paper, we have a short chapter on that, and we look at simple measures of intergenerational persistence in education status and also in earnings, and we don't see much change there. And I think what's really going on is this these two countervailing effects. At first, the kids of poor parents, they suffer because the poor parents have less means to help them out. But on the other hand, the kids that come from better educated households, they are more of these marginal kids for whom human capital really matters. So in a sense, they have more to lose, but the parents also counteract more. And I think it seems to be that these two effects cancel each other out. But I want to point out that Minchul Yum has a recent paper on the school closures, which looks more on this intergenerational persistence than on these long-term effects as we do. So it has a different focus, and they find an increase in intergenerational persistence due to the school closure, especially if you look specifically at children that come from disadvantaged households. Yeah. So I think it also depends a bit of the measure that you use or where you look at in the spectrum.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so Nicholas, I think has another question, if I'm correct.
Yes, me again. Sorry, it's really the paper's fascinating. To raise two of the questions I want to ask. Have you considered, or if it's feasible, to include demographic characteristics of race and ethnicity, both in the parent states, but also in the wage profiles? I guess also the wage profiles of the children. That's the first question. And the second one was, I can't remember if you're considering on the labor supply side the impact on participation, because we know it's having a big impact on labor force participation decisions of mothers. I mean, in the US, if you look at what happened to participation rates for mothers with children the age of 6 to 17, it fell in April and never recovered.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, thanks a lot. So on the first question, no, we never looked at further characteristics like race. Also, really the only ones we look at is parental education and marital status. And I agree, it would be interesting to look at many more dimensions. It makes the model more complicated, and there's not so much data then to have different assumptions. But for sure, I think there are more heterogeneities there that would be very interesting to exploit. On the second, I mean, our model has exogenous labor supply, so we don't have any effects on labor supply. But also our model is really about the children. So what we really care about is what happens to the children. and not so much what happens to the parents. So this is wrongly expressed. It's not that we don't care about it, but it's not, we don't analyze it in this paper. So I think what you're pointing out is very important, that the parents of these children, they had to scale back their labor supply partly, and that might have long-term effects. And there is this paper by Michel Tertil, Matthias Döpke, and co-authors who look exactly at that, and they find these long-term effects, but they also find interesting effect that it might also lead to shift in culture, because now more parents, more fathers also suddenly get involved into childcare. So I think that's a fascinating question. What effect it has long-term on the long-term labor market outcome of the parents. But it's the paper, the model is not built to answer this question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have to go assist with a Zoom kindergarten transition myself.
Thanks for your questions.
Okay, so, and I think, you know, we are out of time, so perfect timing for that as well. So thanks, Nicola and co-authors, for a very stimulating paper and talk. And if you want to chat more about the paper, there is a Zoom room that you can join. So Kurt has added in the chat a link to the Zoom meeting that will take us to the breakout room. So you can just copy that and then close this meeting and log into our Zoom room meeting. And thanks so much to Nicola especially, and all the co-authors and all the attendants.